Mojo Projo donated on Patreon at the Mythic tier for an entire year and sponsors today's video. Voja is a surprisingly unique commander in that it's merging two tribes into one deck, a tactic that we don't often see in Commander. Unfortunately, wolves still aren't quite there as a tribe. There are some good individual cards which I have included, but for the most part we're going to be focusing on elves in this deck, with a smattering of wolves here and there to help keep our hand full. So we'll get the obvious mana includes out of the way first. All the typical culprits like the Dorks, Llanowar Elves, Finhorn Elves and Mystic. Some that tap for more than just one mana, such as Jiraga Tree Speaker, which taps for 2 mana, and Bloom Tender, which will give us Naya colours. We also have some Dorks that care about counters, and we should be seeing plenty of counters in this deck. Incubation Druid, Gaia Sage, Rishkar and Marwyn provide more mana when more plus counters are placed on there. Farhaven Elf and Wood Elves just give us permanent ramp in the form of a land, and I'll sneak a wolf in here called Cemetery Prowler, which you'll probably want to exile a creature with so that you can get the cost reduction on creatures. Then there's the big hitters like Priest of Titania, Elvish Archdruid and Circle of Dreams Druid, the latter of which does include the wolves when calculating how much mana it produces. And one you don't get to play much in elf decks, but we're in Naya colours and we do want to be swinging in, so definitely consider Grand Warlord Rada when building your Voja decks. I don't normally like relying on creatures so much for mana because they're fragile and you lose a hell of a lot of mana on board wipes, but this is elves and you can accelerate ahead ridiculously fast. Plus the Dorks aren't dead in the late game, as they can be buffed massively enough to help with the go wide strategy. And in order to go wide we need to be making tokens, so we've got Elvish Warmaster, Wolverine Riders and Windswift Slice in order to do just that, the latter of which being some removal with upside. But it's not just elf tokens we want to be making, it's wolves as well. And the more the merrier, because the more wolves we have, the more card draw we get from our commander. Wolfbriar Elemental has been a staple for green decks in need of mana sinks for years, and it pulls double duty here with the throngs of wolf tokens it's going to provide. Hollow Henge Overlord is a lot to ask for 6 mana, and if it didn't have flash I wouldn't run it, but with your commander in play you can slam this down before your turn, make 2 more wolves, and then swing in with your commander to draw at least 4. Not bad in a pinch. Howl of the Night pack is another expensive one, but we're in elves so it shouldn't be too difficult. And alongside Yavimaya, the later the game goes the more and more wolves you'll be making. And we can't talk about wolf tokens without looking at the inspiration for the commander. We're including Tolsimir in all 3 iterations here, just for the sake of keeping those wolf tokens coming, and it keeps us on theme as well. But it's not all about tokens, we do have some non-token utility creatures to consider as well. Arwen gives us some redundancy on the counters front, but also makes creatures bigger and bigger the longer she's in play, as does Jiraga Warcaller, who can dump counters on itself to further buff the army, but it can also come down for just 1 mana, and wait for Voja to throw counters on there to further buff the elves that way. And Nara is a wolf that will give our commander indestructible, making it easier to swing in with, and Roaming Throne will likely enter as a wolf so that we can get double the triggers from our commander, plus it will count towards the card draw if it's a wolf. But why choose between wolves and elves when you can have both? Shields of Velis Vel makes all our creatures a wolf and an elf for just 1 mana, and Mirror Entity is one of the few shapeshifters in the deck which counts as both an elf and a wolf too, and can be activated for very little mana, giving the same benefit to all our other creatures as well. If your army has a bunch of counters and anthems in play, you could even activate this for 0 and have no creatures die. I'll quickly mention the Maskwood Nexus here, as it's not a card I usually decide to keep in decks, but where card draw is concerned I think it's well worth upping the wolf count with a card like this. Another changeling like Taurian Mauler not only counts as both tribes, but also cares about plus counters. This thing gets huge at the best of times, but it'll grow even hugerer in this deck. And Masked Vandal gives us some removal on a changeling body. Speaking of which, let's get a closer look at the removal package. We've seen the Vandal, but we've also got the classic Reclamation Sage, which also targets artifacts and enchantments. Tolsimir, Friend to Wolves, we've also already seen, but that can have the wolves fight pesky creatures out of the way. Not too much in the form of tribal removal here, so just added some generic cards like Swords, Beast Within, and Stroke of Midnight. I've already shown you Windswift Slice, which pulls double duty, as does Response and Resurgence. The response side deals 5 damage to an attacking or blocking creature, which will usually be enough to take it out, or at least allow it to be blocked successfully. And Resurgence is one of the 2 extra combats in the deck, which are worth including as our commander triggers on attacks. It's worth noting that Resurgence should only be cast during the first main, as it gives Vigilance, which is good for your swole mana dorks, but doesn't untap your creatures during the second combat, unlike our second extra combat card, Waves of Aggression, which untaps each creature that already attacked this turn. The Retrace should be useful here, as I imagine you'll be able to draw a surplus of cards enough to discard lands with the waves. With all that mana that elves can produce, we may be able to cast this multiple times a turn. On the tail end of the removal set, Damning Verdict and Austere Command are hopefully going to be sweepers that act in our favour most of the time. Making all these huge creatures is great, but how can we push damage through? Bramblewood Paragon won't necessarily see too many warriors, but it will see a hell of a lot of counters and give those creatures trample. This also includes our wolves like Wandering Wolf, which can get so big that no other creatures will be big enough to block it, and Pyreheart Wolf means you're forcing your opponents to gang up as opposed to making chump blocks. Hopefully that means that you'll be able to go wide with way more effect. Shalai and Halar see a hell of a lot of counters during combat. Count them all, and then throw that amount of damage at someone's face. The same goes for All Will Be One, except this is on a permanent that's much more difficult to remove. And we'll round things off by looking at the card draw for the deck. Obviously we want to be drawing off our commander, but sometimes that's just not possible for countless reasons, so we'll need some redundancy that we can rely on. Leaf Crowned Visionary helps us cantrip our elves, and Armorcraft Judge can just straight up refill our hand if all is going to plan. Wheel of Fortune gives everyone 7 cards, but if timed correctly can benefit you more than your opponents. At the very least it keeps the game moving. Shamanic Revelation counts the number of creatures and draws accordingly, and it lightly gains you a hell of a lot of life too, which could buy you a turn or two, whilst Rishkar's Expertise draws you a bunch and then gives you a free 5 mana spell for some reason. Hunter's Insight can be placed on an unsuspecting creature your opponents don't mind letting through, and Inspiring Call is Wrath Protection and Massive Card Draw. Not a bad combination. Return of the Wild Speaker is another modal card that gives you Overrun, but also lets you draw cards equal to the highest power, and we expect to have big power in this deck. Sylvan Library and the Great Henge round us off here. The former is great with the fetches and other shuffle effects so that you can dictate your draws throughout the game, and Henge adds to the counter shenanigans as well as cantrips on non-tokens entering. Shouldn't cost much more than 2 mana to get into play, and it'll likely pay for itself once you tap it for 2 mana. So there we are, boys and girls. Voja the Direwolf is ready and raring to tear your opponents a new one, until they discover that he can be easily distracted by various meat-based products. Look forward to seeing some gameplays in the next week or two. See ya.